Welcome to Libyth. I'm glad you're here. This week we are in ancient Japan with the Kojiki. Today we close the week with the ideas, the themes underneath the Kojiki, and what they leave us with. We've read the Kojiki, looked at how its story is built, and spent time with its characters. The gods who grieve and fail and create, the humans who are used up by the projects they are asked to carry, the anonymous figures without whom none of it would exist. Today, I want to go to the deepest layer. The ideas. What does this book actually believe? Not what it claims to believe, not the official position it adopts in its political function, but the deeper understanding of the world that shows up in its structure, its silences, its choice of which stories to tell and how to tell them. And because this is where a text gets most interesting, where do its beliefs pull against each other? Where does the Kojiki contradict itself, and what does that contradiction reveal? The central tension that organizes everything in the Kojiki is this: what is the relationship between order and the forces that threaten it? Creation in this text is never innocent and never clean. The world is made alongside chaos, death, and impurity. Order is established again and again across the 3 volumes, and again something disrupts it, sometimes from outside, sometimes from within the divine household itself, sometimes from the nature of the creative act that produced the order in the first place. The text does not resolve this tension. It enshrines it. It returns to it compulsively. Every major episode can be read as a variation on the same fundamental question. How does order maintain itself against the forces that are constitutive of it? Think of this question as a thread running through every scene we're about to trace, the world being stitched together and pulled apart, stitched and pulled across the full length of the text. The first theme is purity, pollution, and the sacred. And to understand it, you need to understand that in the world the Kojiki describes, purity and pollution are not primarily moral categories. They are metaphysical ones. They describe states of being that have real consequences in the world, and that require appropriate ritual responses to manage. This distinction is crucial because it means that impurity in the Kojiki is not the same as sin in, say, the Christian tradition. Impurity can be incurred through contact with death, blood, or the world of the dead, without any moral failure on the part of the person who is affected. It is more like a contagious condition than a judgment. And the appropriate response to it is not repentance but purification, a ritual act, often involving water, that restores the affected person to a state in which they can participate in social and religious life. The scene that makes this most explicit is one we have already spent time with: Izanagi's return from Yomi. He has descended to the underworld to retrieve his dead wife. He has looked at her decaying body in defiance of a prohibition. He has fled, been pursued, blocked the entrance to Yomi with a great stone. And then he goes to a river, a specific river, the Izanagi River, and he washes. The text describes the washing in meticulous detail. He throws off his clothing, and gods are born from each garment as it falls. He plunges into the water, and gods are born from the upper, middle, and lower levels of the water. He washes his left eye, and Amaterasu, the sun goddess, the supreme deity of the Kojiki, is born. He washes his right eye, and Tsukuyomi, the moon god, is born. He washes his nose, and Susanoo, the storm god, is born. 3 of the most important deities in the Japanese pantheon are produced by an act of ritual purification after contact with death. The source of the sun is a moment of cleansing from contamination. The supreme authority that underpins the imperial claim is produced by washing off the defilement of the underworld. This is not a paradox the Kojiki resolves. It is a paradox it enshrines. Impurity is generative as well as dangerous. You must guard against contamination, and yet contamination, the encounter with death and dissolution, is precisely where the most important new things come from. That double truth makes ritual look less like moral theater and more like a kind of craft. The dangerous material must be approached with care, managed with proper technique, and then the things produced from the encounter with it can be extraordinary. The purification is not a return to a prior state of innocence. It is a transformation. The person who has been in contact with death and has been properly purified is not the same as the person who has never been in contact with death. Something has passed through them that could not have passed through them otherwise. The social consequences of this logic are visible in the world described on Tuesday. The Senmen, the people assigned to the ritually impure occupations of butchering, tanning, and burial, are not moral failures. They are people whose work places them in constant contact with the forces that the Kegir logic designates as dangerous, and the community manages that danger by placing them at the margins. The logic is internally consistent. If contact with death is ontologically hazardous, then the people who handle death regularly must be managed carefully to prevent the contamination from spreading. That consistency doesn't make the social arrangement just. It makes it comprehensible, and understanding it as comprehensible is the first step toward understanding how systems of exclusion that seem irrational to outsiders are experienced as entirely rational by those who maintain them. In contemporary life, we've rerouted the logic, but we haven't abandoned the underlying structure. Political scandals are described in the language of contamination. A politician is tainted by association. A brand is damaged by contact with a controversy. A person's reputation is poisoned by proximity to wrongdoing. The ritualized public cleanup that follows, the press conference, the resignation, the period of visible contrition, is structurally identical to a purification rite. The metaphors have changed. Soap for salt water, courts and cameras for shrines and rivers. But the premise that certain contacts are existentially dangerous, and that the appropriate response to them is a visible public act of cleansing, is the same premise that produces the Kegir logic of the Kojiki. The second theme is power and its legitimation. And this is where the Kojiki is most explicitly a political document, most clearly arguing for a specific arrangement of authority and working to make that arrangement seem not chosen, but given. The genealogical structure of the Kojiki, the unbroken chain from Amaterasu through Ninigi, through the divine ancestors to the human emperors, is not decoration. It is the argument. The myth says, sovereignty is not an accident of birth in the ordinary sense. It is not even the outcome of political skill or military success, though those things are also present in the narrative. It is descent from the sun. The long lists of names that occupy significant portions of the second and third volumes, the catalogues of emperors, their consorts, the children of their unions, are the narrative form of a legal claim. These people have the right to rule because they can demonstrate, through a chain of named ancestors, that they descend from the deity who stands at the origin of the cosmos itself. The genealogy is the legitimacy, rendered in the form of names rather than argument. But but the Kojiki refuses. And this is what makes it more interesting than a simple piece of political propaganda, to present divine authority as automatic or self-sustaining. The gods squabble. They make mistakes. They are subject to grief and rage and shame. Their authority is real, but it is not immune to challenge, and it must be maintained through ongoing ritual. The cave episode is the most explicit statement of this. Amaterasu, the supreme deity, hides herself in a cave. The world goes dark. And the mechanism by which she is drawn out is not divine compulsion or force. It is communal performance, the assembled gods celebrating loudly enough to make her curious, a communal act of festivity and laughter that restores the light. The imperial claim depends on ongoing rites, on the community's repeated enactment of its acknowledgement that the authority is real. Take away the ritual, and the authority is in the dark. Pause that creates a profound contradiction that the Kojiki cannot resolve and does not try to. If the emperor descends from the sun, what happens when an emperor behaves catastrophically? The genealogy gives you a reason to accept authority. It does not give you a mechanism for accountability when that authority is destructive. The text makes two claims simultaneously. The ruler is sacred, and sacredness is fragile. The ruler is divinely ordained, and the divine order requires constant communal maintenance to remain operative. The claim to inevitability and the acknowledgement of contingency coexist in the same text without resolution. The consequences of that unresolved tension played out across Japanese history in ways that were sometimes beautiful and sometimes catastrophic. The Kojiki was used by Matori Norinaga and the Kokugaku movement in the 18th century to argue for a return to a pure Japanese spirit, untainted by Chinese influence. It was used in the Meiji period to support the construction of state Shinto and the elevation of the emperor to a divine center of national identity. It was used in the run-up to the Second World War to justify imperial expansion as the fulfillment of a divine mandate. None of these uses were inevitable from the text itself, but all of them were made possible by the text's unresolved tension between the claim to sacred inevitability and the acknowledgement that sacredness must be continuously performed. A text that says both, the ruler is sacred, and sacredness is fragile, is available to whoever controls the performance. The third theme is death, grief, and what cannot be recovered. And the Kojiki approaches this with a psychological honesty that is genuinely remarkable for a text that is also a political charter. The descent of Izanagi into Yomi to retrieve Izanami is the text's most extended and most painful account of loss. And what makes it painful is not the horror of what Izanagi sees, but the psychological precision with which the narrative traces the shape of a grief that cannot accept its own limits. He goes not from heroism. He goes because he cannot bear the absence. He is given instructions that set the terms of return. Wait for me. Do not look at me. Do not enter the inner rooms. And he violates them not from malice or impatience, but from the specific, irresistible need to see the person he has lost. That need overrides every promise. That need overrides the explicit condition of return. That need is the need. And the seeing destroys everything. Pause the text does not moralize about Izanagi's failure. It does not tell you that he should have trusted, or that he should have been patient, or that his grief was inappropriate. It shows what happens when grief refuses its own limits, and it shows the consequences without cushioning them with moral instruction. The consequences are irreversible. The living and the dead are separated. The entrance to Yomi is blocked. The relationship between the primal creative couple is ended permanently. And yet, and this is the ambivalence that makes the episode philosophically rich rather than simply tragic. The consequences of the failure are also generative. Izanagi's purification, after fleeing Yomi, produces Amaterasu. His failure to retrieve his wife produces the deity of the sun. The loss is real and permanent. The things produced by the loss are also real and permanent. The text holds both of those truths simultaneously without resolving them into a lesson. That ambivalence is not consolation. It is description. The Kojiki is observing something that every tradition of mourning eventually arrives at. The past, once violated, is gone, but the act of attempting to reclaim it rearranges what remains. You cannot get Izanami back. But the attempt to get her back produces Amaterasu, Tsukuyomi, and Susanoo, the three deities who organize the structure of the world. Whether that trade is worth it is a question the text does not answer. It simply shows that the trade happened, and that the world as we know it is organized by the consequences of a grief that could not accept its own limits. The dead, in the Kojiki's world, are also a source of authority. The ancestors who legitimate the claim to rule, the chain of divine descent that the genealogies trace, are the dead. They are gone, but their names are the legal foundation of the living dynasty. The past is both contamination and legitimacy. It defiles through proximity and authorizes through descent. That double nature of the ancestral dead, dangerous to approach and necessary to invoke, is one of the Kojiki's most precise accounts of how the past functions in political life. We are contaminated by the past, and we derive our authority from it. Both of these things are always true simultaneously. The question is which one we are managing in any given moment. The fourth theme is the sacred in the natural world, and this is where the Kojiki's cosmological claims have the most surprising contemporary resonance, for reasons the text could not have anticipated. The Kojiki does not treat the natural world as backdrop or resource. It treats it as participant. The islands of Japan are not discovered. They are born, produced by the stirring of a jeweled spear in the ocean, and named by the gods who made them. Each island has a divine origin, a sacred genealogy as real as the genealogy of any human clan. The mountains are not topographic features. They are kami, spirits with particular characters and particular histories, whose moods influence the climate and health of the districts around them. Rivers are alive. The sea is a domain governed by deities who are not subservient to human arrangements. The rice paddy is a ritual site as much as an agricultural field. This cosmology has practical consequences built into it. If a mountain is a kami, you do not approach it as a resource to be extracted. You enter into a relationship with it, a relationship defined by offering, attention, and the acknowledgement of the mountain's prior claim on the space. If a river floods, the flood is not simply a meteorological event. It is a message, a communication from a being with agency, requiring a ritual response, offerings, purification, an acknowledgement that something in the relationship between human activity and the river's sacred character has gone wrong. The bodily and the spiritual are braided so tightly in this cosmology that environmental practice is inseparable from religious practice. You cannot manage the natural world without managing your relationship to the kami that inhabit it. Ecology and theology are the same discipline. The kami, however, are not helpful extras. The Kojiki insists on this repeatedly. They are often dangerous, unpredictable, and entirely indifferent to human convenience. The sea can kill you. The mountain storm does not consult your travel plans. The kami of the rice paddy can withhold the harvest. Reverence is required not because the kami are benevolent, but because they are powerful, and their power must be acknowledged if you want to survive in proximity to it. Worship here contains a realism about the nature of the sacred world that is considerably more honest than many religious traditions. The world is not organized for human benefit. It is organized according to its own logic, and human beings must learn to operate within that logic or suffer the consequences of failing to acknowledge it. The fifth theme is the tension between chaos and order, the question that runs most visibly through the surface of the text, and that generates the most immediate narrative energy. Susanoo is the Kojiki's great testing of this question. He is the figure who embodies disruption, who carries in his body the grief and rage and creative potential that ordered systems cannot hold. And his story asks, without ever explicitly posing the question, is the force that threatens order the enemy of order or its condition? Is chaos the thing that must be expelled, or the thing that, properly managed, makes creation possible? The text's explicit answer is conservative. Order wins. Amaterasu's line becomes the imperial line. Susanoo's line yields. The celestial hierarchy is restored. Disruption is expelled, then ritualized. Susanoo becomes a cultural ancestor, a genealogical source for powerful clans, a figure whose myths are preserved and honored within the framework of the very order that expelled him. But it is not given the throne. Chaos has a function, the Kojiki says. It does not have sovereignty. And yet the text's sympathies are visibly more complicated than its explicit argument. Susanoo is the most alive figure in the entire Kojiki. He has the most interiority, the most transformation, the most fully realized emotional arc. The scene of his composing the first Japanese poem is given more narrative attention and more aesthetic care than most of the genealogical material that occupies the later volumes. The text mourns Yamato Takeru with explicit emotional investment. It preserves the lament of Okunanashi's displacement with a delicacy that exceeds its political necessity. The Kojiki makes room for grief and disruption and loss in ways that its official political project does not require and sometimes works against. That excess of emotional honesty, that willingness to record the human cost of the arrangements it is also endorsing, is what makes the text more than a piece of propaganda. The structural implication is one that the text cannot quite say out loud. If Susanoo's exile is the furnace that produces the first poem, then order is parasitic on the disruption it expels. If the purification of Izanagi, the cleansing away of contamination, produces the sun, then order requires its opposite as a generative condition. The Kojiki keeps arriving at this conclusion from different directions. Creation requires destruction. Order requires chaos. The sacred requires the impure. The living requires the dead. These are not comforting observations. They are honest ones. And the text's willingness to enshrine the tension rather than resolve it is, finally, the most important thing about it. Now step back and look for the book's deepest contradiction, the place where its two most fundamental claims most clearly pull against each other, and where that pulling produces the most interesting intellectual consequences. The Kojiki makes two claims that cannot rest easy together. The first, the world is governed by divine will, and the imperial line descends from Amaterasu. Authority is sacred, inevitable, cosmologically grounded. The order we inhabit is the order the gods established, and participating in it is participation in the divine structure of reality. The second, the gods are fallible, emotional, capable of catastrophic error, vulnerable to grief and isolation. Authority is fragile, contingent, dependent on ongoing ritual maintenance, and capable of going dark in a cave if the conditions are not right. These two claims exist side by side in every major scene. They are not reconciled. They are allowed to coexist, to generate tension, to keep the text from settling into either blind deference or total cynicism. That tension is not a flaw in the political theology. It is the political theology. By making sacredness performative, by requiring that it be continuously enacted through ritual, genealogy, and shrine maintenance, the Kojiki both empowers rulers and constrains them. Their authority is anchored to a web of sacred obligations and relationships. Break those relationships, and the authority goes dark. But the community that performs the rites also, implicitly, judges the ruler's fitness to be the focus of those rites. The Kojiki cannot grant absolute authority without also granting the community the power to withdraw its ritual recognition. It creates both the claim and the mechanism of its contestation in the same text without acknowledging that it has done so. Where does the Kojiki sit in the wider history of ideas? It belongs clearly to the broad family of animist cosmologies, texts that treat the world as populated by particular spirits who demand attention and ritual response, whose moods shape the weather and the harvest and the health of communities that live in their proximity. The Popol Vuh of the Kh, Maya, which, like the Kojiki, fuses creation narrative with dynastic genealogy, and was produced in a context where indigenous oral tradition was being fixed into writing under political pressure. The Vedic hymns of the Indian tradition share with the Kojiki an understanding of ritual as the mechanism that maintains cosmic order. That if the sacrifices are not performed, the world will come apart. Within Japan, the Kojiki's most immediate interlocutor is the Nihon Shoki, compiled just 8 years later in 720 CE, which retells many of the same myths with different emphases, different versions, and a more explicitly Chinese rhetorical register. Reading the two texts together reveals which details in the Kojiki were choices, which versions of stories were selected, and which were set aside, and makes the editorial and political character of the Kojiki's compilation visible in a way that reading the Kojiki in isolation cannot. The Kojiki's deepest kinship with other texts is philosophical rather than narrative. The shared human need to ground the present in a sacred past, to make the current arrangement of power feel like something other than an accident of force, to tell a story about where everything came from that makes the world feel less contingent and more trustworthy. Every civilization that has produced such stories has answered that need differently. What the Kojiki contributes to the conversation is a particular combination, a cosmology of imperfect, emotionally complex gods whose authority must be maintained through ritual, a genealogical argument for imperial legitimacy that is honest about its own political function, while also preserving the beauty and complexity of the traditions it is organizing, and a willingness to hold the tension between sacred inevitability and contingent fragility without resolving it into a doctrine. 2 honest assessments before we close. What to carry forward from the Kojiki, and what is dangerous if taken as literal doctrine. What to carry: a difficult and almost stoic clarity about impurity, loss, and the generative power of the encounter with both. The Kojiki teaches, not as a lesson, but as a structural observation repeated across every major episode, that the encounter with death and dissolution is not simply a thing to be defended against. It is often the raw material from which new forms of life emerge. Izanagi's contamination by the underworld yields the gods who organize the world. Susanoo's exile yields the first poem. Okunanashi's displacement yields an invisible authority more durable than the visible sovereignty he lost. This is not a promise of meaning. It is not a claim that suffering is good. It is an observation, careful, unsentimental, confirmed again and again across the length of the text, that in the wake of what cannot be held onto, something new tends to come into being. That observation is available to you as a way of moving through your own losses. Not consolation, but orientation. What is dangerous if taken as literal doctrine? The Kojikis claim that political authority is divinely ordained and therefore beyond the reach of ordinary human accountability. This claim was used in the 20th century to support state Shinto and imperial ideology, and the consequences were catastrophic. For Japan, for the countries Japan invaded, for the millions of people who died in a war prosecuted partly in the name of a divine mandate that had its textual roots in a document compiled in a Nara court in 712 CE. The Kojiki is not to blame for its misuse. Every founding myth is vulnerable to weaponization. But the reader who approaches the text should approach it with the awareness that beauty and authority do not neutralize each other's dangers. The Kojiki is beautiful. It is also, in certain readings, a weapon. Carry it carefully. Return now to the question we opened with. What is the relationship between order and the forces that threaten it? After a week with the Kojiki, you do not have a final answer. What you have is a better question. Or rather, you have the Kojiki's way of holding the question, which is more useful than any answer. The world is constantly being stitched together and ripped. The stitches are ritual, genealogy, careful maintenance of the relationships between the living and the dead and the divine. The tears are death, grief, rage, the irresistible impulse to look at what you have been told not to look at. Both of these things are always true simultaneously. The text doesn't ask you to choose between them. It asks you to stay awake to both. What you have now that you didn't have on Monday is not certainty. It's attention, a trained capacity to notice the moments where purity and pollution, authority and fragility, grief and creation, sacredness and danger all meet and refuse to be sorted. The Kojiki leaves that knot open. It has been leaving it open for 1,300 years. It will leave it open for you if you let it. That's all for today on Libyth. If you want to follow the whole journey, subscribe, a new book every week. At least we try.